Hello, and welcome to a Jesus Followers 30-Year Journey to Judaism podcast, an audio adaptation of the memoir of similar name. I am your host and the author, J.S. Clark. In this podcast, I will be reading for you the story of my growing up as a sincere follower of the Nazarene and the questions that led me to the old path of the Jewish people. With the help of the Almighty, on with the show. But isn't the law ended with Jesus? Later, I will give a more developed defense of why I believed the followers of Jesus ought to keep Torah, but that had not developed at this time. But I should demonstrate that there were also biblical reasons that I believed Jack was correct. The first thing that probably came to mind in those days was that the law was described as eternal. Exodus 12:17, 28:43, and 31:17 are just a few verses that describe certain commandments as being forever, le'olam. If the command was forever, naturally this implied the law was forever. Exodus 31:16 describes the Sabbath as not just a command, but an everlasting covenant. Deuteronomy 12:28 tells Israel that obedience to the law will cause life to go well for the obedient, forever. Deuteronomy 7:9 says that God keeps covenant with those who keep his commandments for 1,000 generations. Deuteronomy 29:29 says that the things that are revealed belong to the children of Israel forever. Why? So that they can do the law. One could nitpick some of these evidences. Olam, for example, can and is legitimately used for a time period that is not eternal. However, one could fairly point out that the same possibility exists in regards to the Greek equivalent from which we understand eternal life. One might also say that only certain commands are described as eternal. That may be fair, but if a Bible student is going to obsess so much about the presence or absence of the word eternal, then they might ask, where does the Bible say the new covenant is eternal? Surely an honest student can admit that real study cannot be so narrow. Is there anything in the context of the Mosaic covenant that naturally limits its use of olam? Or is someone simply arguing that somewhere else, in a completely alien context, that it did mean something less than eternal? And even if we grant another time limit, where do we see what time limit it is? What good is a promise of olam if it could be either 30 millennia or 30 seconds? Psalm 111 says that God will always be mindful of his covenant. The one being, in effect, at the time, would have been Moses, and that he commanded it forever. This goes again to that question of a limited olam. How can you command something for olam without telling them how long the olam is? If there is a limit, Psalm 105:8 would indicate it is 1,000 generations. That could be 40,000 years and up. Then I would also have recalled the words of Jesus in Matthew 5:17 through 19. Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. In the Greek, fill up. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled. Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments, and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Some tried to tell me at this time that the verse hinges on all being fulfilled, the claim being that Jesus fulfilled, therefore it could pass away. If that were the case, then why add in the second caveat about heaven and earth passing away? This, by the way, would indicate that an olam, in Jesus' understanding, as regards the law, is the lifespan of the universe, which is what olam, a word for world, means. But Jesus was going to die in less than 3 years, so why not just say, until I fulfill all? Second, if the law is good, then why would Jesus fulfilling it mean that his followers, who are supposed to act like him, would not follow it? And what sense does it make to go out of the way to say, I'm not here to destroy the law, warn his audience against anyone who would teach to break even the least commandment, but be thinking in his heart, all of this will be irrelevant in 3 years? This kind of thinking leads to the theology, which I have heard from various Jesus followers, that everything Jesus taught before the crucifixion was technically under the old law, and therefore morally does not apply to Jesus' followers unless it is repeated elsewhere in the New Testament. In other words, following Jesus is not about emulating Jesus, but about emulating the followers of Jesus. This did not seem tenable to me. Jesus' followers would also point out a number of passages in the epistles of Paul that purported to demonstrate the law was done away with, abrogated, or annulled, nailed to the cross, as some used Colossians 2. This too seemed untenable. If Jesus warned us against anyone telling us to break the law, and Paul was his follower, then Paul could not mean what he appeared to mean. From that premise, I argued that what was actually being addressed were either traditions of men or pagan practices. As I wrote, this was my early defense as understood by a 16-year-old. Some elements I still stand by, others have evolved, but suffice to say I embraced the law and rejected the church's abrogation of the law with reason. Messianic Judaism. Things began to change from that moment on. I quit my job at Pizza Hut. Hard to serve pig to others when you think eating it is an abomination. And the core group started celebrating the feasts of the Lord. And, I might add, without ongoing management from Jack. Our first Passover we celebrated with a measure of church blessing in the parsonage, with, I am surprised to recall, no leadership interference beyond a parental chaperone who was already friendly to our cause. We roasted lamb in a wine, which did not turn out as tasty as it sounded. I am pretty sure we had to settle for grape juice for the 4 cups of wine. The church was only going to go so far for their wayward youths. And the matzah, unleavened bread, that we made from cornmeal was truly bread of affliction. Blech. But it left a memory, right? To this day, if I listen to my Adonai CD, I am transported back to those days in a mostly empty blue house, eating on the floor, because you were supposed to recline. It was a good beginning, one of those bonding experiences of people trying to live in community, even before that was a conscious idea in our minds. But we knew that we did not really know what we were doing, so we started seeking out Messianic Jews. What are Messianic Jews? What is Messianic Judaism? That is hard to succinctly define, even now, especially now. But what I understood in those days was that they were Jews who believed in Jesus, but differed from normal churches in that they understood the New Testament should be understood through the Jewish lens because it was written by Jews. I do not know where we heard that label first or how we found the local congregation, but we did. Kehilat HaMashiach. To this day, I have some hard feelings about Kehilat HaMashiach, Congregation of the Messiah, but it was what many of us needed in that time. We being my older brother Daniel and his then-girlfriend Adrian, Carl and his then-girlfriend Donna, Mike and his then-girlfriend Melissa, and myself. As with MLCC, my negative feelings have moderated much. Back then I was still in my teens, hot-headed, arrogant, etc. Some of what would happen would be my fault, but the beginning was wonderful. Before it was called Kehilat HaMashiach, it went by something more generic, like Messianic Jewish Fellowship of Spokane, or something like that. They met in a school gym on Shabbat, Sabbath. It was a humble and joyful introduction to this movement called Messianic Judaism. The first thing I noticed was how surreal it was to be going to a church separately from my parents. But just behind that was the dancing. In Messianic congregations, worship usually entails dancing with music. That part may not be as Jewish as it seemed at the time. As far as I have seen, Orthodox Jews do not dance at Shabbat services in the shul, synagogue. Certainly not with mixed genders, but they do dance elsewhere. Dancing felt new to me, but not odd. David danced, after all. The dancers had to wrangle me in at first, but honestly, it changed the way I worship. Here we Jesus followers were, worshiping the giver of every perfect gift, yet in most of my church experience, we sang a limited range of songs and stood like wooden pegs in our seats. How could worship be expressed with voice alone? A few churches did dangerous things, like raising their hands, but many did not even stand for the standard 3 songs. Dancing made so much sense, and it felt so good to throw your whole body into worship. And while exhibitionism is to be frowned on, there is an element of worship where we should be casting aside our normal sense of dignity. The only reason I had trouble joining in dance, hesitancy which lasted a couple weeks, was that inside I was afraid to embarrass myself. But how could I be afraid to embarrass myself when worship of God was the result? A man who is too embarrassed to get down on one knee for the girl of his dreams does not deserve her. What of the man or woman who is too embarrassed to dance for their God? Other elements of my experience may seem superficial men-pleasing, like learning to wear a kippah just because everyone else did, but this provided a cultural shift for me. Evangelicals and related Protestants sometimes speak of ritual and trappings as almost necessary evils that should not have any real bearing on faith. I think many would baptize without water if they could. But does that make sense? Do you think Yeshua, Jesus, instituted baptism and communion because he thought ceremony was an evil or a hindrance? If ritual and custom have no meaning, then why don't you go to a church in your boxers and slippers? Why not sprawl out wherever you feel like and talk during the service on your cell phone, etc.? Do you think worshiping in a sewer would be the same as in a church? You inherently recognize that decorum and setting matter to worship. But these are just details of ceremony or ritual. If the teacher gets up and starts talking with the same vocabulary as a street thug, then this tells you the church you are in may not be serious about the Word of God. Or suppose you wandered into a service and the preacher said, "Our God or goddess, whichever you prefer, may not really have done this miracle literally." You would surmise that their doctrine may not be in line with someone like Alistair Begg or James MacDonald. How you conduct service and how you speak not only indicates the doctrinal camp that you are in, but also shapes your church culture and even the way you think. So I started using Yeshua in place of Jesus, Shabbat instead of Sabbath, a kippah appeared on my head while I was at service, and Hebrew started popping up in my vocabulary because I understood that the use of Hebrew and Jewish customs reinforced what I was learning, that the scriptures had to be understood from a Jewish perspective. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you liked what you heard, please like, share, and subscribe. If you didn't like it, no one likes a tattletale, and it's my first podcast that I didn't record in my car on a phone, so go easy on me. If you really liked it and want to show support, feel free to visit J.S. Clark on Patreon. Or you can buy or recommend one of my books, including Finding Home, a Jesus Follower's 30-Year Journey to Judaism, available on Lulu, Amazon, and Smashwords. If you have questions or comments, reach me at jsclarkpresents@gmail.com. If it fits, I'll plug it into the show. I'm also to be found on X at jsclark5768 or Threads at jsclarkpresents. Lastly, more info and occasional updates at jsclarkwordcraftsman.net. All the best.